Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the University of Pennsylvania Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. I am Sonia Carley. I am the Mark Allen Hughes Faculty Director of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. The banners that you saw as you walked up the stairway today and into our Energy Forum memorialize a truly distinguished honor and a line of Carnot Prize recipients through the years. You may have noticed that this year we had to move to another wall because we have filled the entire wall in the years that we've had the Carnot Prize. And we are just so incredibly excited to have this new banner here to honor Jacqueline Patterson. I know that some of you in the audience are familiar with the Carnot Prize, but please allow me to provide a little bit of background about the award for the sake of everyone in the room that doesn't know about it, and to provide a bit of a framework for today's ceremony. The Carnot Prize is the Kleinman Center's annual recognition of distinguished contributions to energy policy through scholarship and practice. Over the years, some esteemed news outlets have reported that this is the world's most respected prize in energy policy, and we tend to agree. 9 years ago, when this award was first conceived, we decided to name it in memory of a famous French scientist. In 1824, Sadi Carnot published Reflections on the Motive Power of Fire, which became the basis for the second law of thermodynamics. Carnot recognized that the power of the steam engine would produce a great revolution in human development, and the Carnot Prize is intended to honor those who have revolutionized our understanding of energy policy. You'll note that the Carnot Prize is housed in a hand-carved wooden box. The bronze medallion inside is shaped like a pocket watch that features a representation of Carnot's vision of the steam engine and its power to produce a great revolution for humankind. And today, helping to produce a similar revolution for humankind is energy, climate, and environmental justice leader Jacqueline, or Jackie Patterson, founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project. Next in our program, we will have Fritz Steiner tell you a bit more about Jackie and share some remarks and present her with the Carnot Prize. But before I hand the mic over to Fritz, I want to thank you all for coming here today, of course, and acknowledge a few key people in the audience. I would like to welcome Scott Kleinman, who generously brought the Kleinman Center to life and continues to help it soar into the next decade. As you might have heard, this year we are, in fact, celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Kleinman Center. We also have some esteemed colleagues in the audience from Penn's president's office, the provost's office, and deans of several schools, and members of our advisory board. Thank you all for coming out today. It is now my privilege to turn the microphone over to Dean Fritz Steiner.
Thank you, Sonia. And on behalf of the faculty, staff, and student body of the Weitzman School of Design, welcome. One of our qualities that sets us apart of the school is that we take a holistic approach to the built environment with programs in city planning, historic preservation, landscape architecture, and fine arts alongside of architecture. From where I sit, the clean energy transition is one of our most daunting design challenges. And some of you sitting out there in the audience may say it's the most daunting chemistry challenge, or legal challenge, our finance challenge, our communications challenge, and certainly veterinary medicine challenge. And what makes Penn so special is our 12 schools enable us to see the world through many different lenses as we tackle today's greatest challenges. The Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, the flagship research unit of the Weitzman School of Design, is housed in this beautiful building, is tackling the challenge of energy transition through improved policy. Some might wonder, why isn't the center in Penn Engineering or Welton or SP2? I am confident that any of those could have made a good home for Kleinman, but just not an optimal one. As the cognitive scientist and Nobel laureate Hermann Simon has noted, Design is fundamentally the act of changing existing condition into preferred ones, changing existing condition into preferred ones. I think that captures the transformational work that we do in Weitzman. And when you get your head around it a little bit, in the United States, 50% of the energy use comes from buildings. Another 25% of the energy use in the United States comes from transportation systems. So 75% of the energy used in the United States and 75% of the greenhouse gases produced comes from the built environment. It's interesting, China, it's very similar. It's between 75 and 80% of the energy use, and the greenhouse gas production also comes from the built environment. And of course, probably everyone knows China and the United States are #1 and #2 in energy use and greenhouse gas production. So what we do with the built environment is really fundamental to our energy transition. Allow me to highlight just briefly some of the Kleinman Center's funded research that's currently happening in the Weitzman School. Urban heat islands are a growing threat to city dwellers, certainly here in Philadelphia and other major cities along the East Coast and around the world. But they have a disproportionate effect on disadvantaged communities. In partnership with SP2's faculty, Dorit, Avit, and William Brahm are researching how we can plan for increasing cooling needs in our most vulnerable population. Several of our city planning faculty, Dominic Vitale, Allison Lassiter, and Michael Nairn, are investigating the carbon impacts of urban orchards, quantifying carbon sequestration by trees and shrubs, and addressing the carbon impacts of local food production. And Sonia Carley is researching how the Inflation Reduction Act may be producing clean energy boom towns, and what impact that has on communities. I could go on, believe me, but that's just some of the work happening in the Weitzman School with support from Weitzman Center grants. And if you travel across the Penn campus, you'll see similar energy and climate work happening in law and engineering and business and communications and medicine and veterinary medicine and more. The challenge in front of us compels us to understand energy policy across many disciplines. Some are very technical, no doubt about it. Technology will be crucial to the energy transition. But today we're focusing on the human side. Jacqueline Patterson, this year's Carnot Prize recipient, reminds us that we cannot move forward without keeping people at the center of our energy transition. Simply building new infrastructure and retiring old infrastructure can put the most vulnerable in precarious situations, from their health to their livelihoods. We cannot move forward in a business as usual fashion. We have learned many lessons from the past and know in the present that if we develop clean energy solutions without considering those at the front lines, we will do harm. The goal of the energy transition should be to bring everyone along and leave no one behind. And I would just remind people of the Hippocratic oath that physicians take, and they begin with do no harm. And we should begin in the same way. Jackie, as her friends know her, and she has many friends, has dedicated her career to this proposition. When she was profiled by Time magazine as one of the Women of the Year in 2014, Jackie explained economy, food, housing, transit, all of these are civil rights issues, and climate issues intersect with every single one. She amplifies the voices of people disproportionately affected by our energy system, people with limited access to clean or affordable energy, and people situated near hazardous sites. Jackie is the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource for Black frontline climate justice leadership. Before that, she founded the NAACP's Climate and Energy Justice Program, where she served for more than a decade as senior director. At the NAACP, she designed and implemented a robust portfolio working with state and local officials whose constituencies included hundreds of communities on the front line of environmental injustice. In the course of her career, Jackie has worked with communities from Uganda to Kansas City. Her passion for social justice has led her to serve as coordinator and co-founder of the Women in Color United, the senior women's rights policy analyst for Action Aid, assistant president of HIV/AIDS program for the IMA World Health, outreach project for the Center of Budget and Policy Priorities, research coordinator for the Johns Hopkins University, and a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Jamaica. She holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Maryland and a master's degree in public health from Johns Hopkins University. Jackie, can you join me at the podium? And since we established this prize in 2015, we've read the same words, and I'm directed to read exactly the same words. So for her distinguished contributions to energy policy, it is my privilege to present on behalf of the University of Pennsylvania and the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, the 2024 Carnot Prize to Jacqueline Patterson. Then back to Rob.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here for this. And I'm just honored. And I want to first really thank Cornelia, thank Dean Fritz, the Kleinman Center, and all the team as a whole, the founding, the living and founding donor for the Kleinman Center, and most especially dear Sonia, who has been an angel of support and encouragement ever since I've met her. So just such a blessing. So I want to start off with the words of a spoken word artist who's in a community, who's from Chicago, which is where I'm from, to really ground us. As you said, I see this as a human rights issue as well as an earth rights issue. So I'll start with centering the words of one of the communities that we work with. So the name of this poem is Hope Isn't a Vacant Lot, and the spoken word artist is Rashina Fountain. In my dream, Chicago blues join the songbirds and melodies of hope, a vision I imagine as a skyscraper promises to you the skies. I wish in new heights, in treetop rebellions, the oaks and maples offer to the children from our ancestors for the continuation of breath. I love beyond white picket fences into avenue streets. I re-envision vacant lots as forest, spaces where we can plant new seed. Home is where footprints survive and all life thrives. I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, where my hopes were somewhat dimmed by the violence propelled by rivaling gangs. The Black Peastone Nation and the El Rookins were the name of the gangs in our neighborhood. My dreams were also dimmed by broken windows, broken sidewalks, and potholed streets. They're dimmed by near roadway air pollution and by the pollution from the mercury, arsenic, and lead that came from the smokestacks of the Fisk, Crawford, and State Line coal-fired power plants that were all within a 10-mile radius of my home. And my hopes were dimmed by the kids who were lost to asthma and the adults who were lost to COPD and other illnesses. So as I think about that as the center of what really brought me to working on energy justice, I want to ground us in this kind of notion of intersectionality. When I started my career as a daycare teacher, where I spent my days sitting around a circle singing Itsy Bitsy Spider, I certainly never thought that years later I would be training people on the utility business model. But this is the way of intersectionality. If I wanted those kids who were in my care to thrive, I had to take a different path to change the systems to make this a world a better place for them to draw breath and to sing to their heart's content. Speaking of intersectionality, when I was working at the NAACP, and one of our foundations asked me to speak at a webinar for the solar industry. And when I handed in my slides, they were like, "Oh, yeah, you're just supposed to be talking about solar, like what, all this other stuff. I'm not seeing how this fits in." And so we went back and forth and back and forth. And then I was like, okay, I won't use slides. And then I renamed my presentation Black Lives Matter, Energy Democracy, and the NAACP Civil Rights Agenda. And then I went on to say what I was going to say in the first place, but without slides. And so after it was said and done, I mean, I really was raising the issues of these communities and raising the intersectional challenges that we need to be thinking about, even as we try to look at a new energy economy. And at the end, the solar installers came up to me and said, or, virtually, and said, like, this has revolutionized the way we think of our work. This has given us a whole nother sense of purpose in what we do. And I've seen that time and time again. When I spoke at a solar event in Colorado, these two young Latina sisters literally came up to me in tears because they said that you've given us a whole new purpose in doing this work around solar. And I was doing a speaking engagement for Vote Solar, and this one person walked up to me who was crying so hard she couldn't even speak. And she said, I never thought of my work this way. I never thought that I'm actually changing the world with this work that I'm doing as a solar provider. And so this is the ways that we think about this work in a way that really brings purpose and really grounds us in the reality of communities. And so I want to lift up the luminaries who are really lighting the path around this work. I think about Kimberly Wasserman from the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization on the south side of Chicago, who, through her leadership, she was instrumental in shutting down those two coal-fired power plants, the Fisk and Crawford plants that I was talking about before. I want to lift up Destiny Watford from Baltimore, where I live now, where she was the youngest person to win the Goldman Prize for her work in blocking the permit for an incinerator that was supposed to be generating energy, but it was also would be harming communities that are already faced with pollution from other sources. I want to lift up Amy Mays, who lives in Arizona, who had her electricity turned off for non-payment in a place that routinely gets above 100 degrees. When I went and visited there, I came out of the plane. I mean, it was at night, and I came off the plane waiting for the bus, or the shuttle bus, and I was so hot, and it was like 10 o'clock at night, and I thought, well, maybe this is just like the exhaust from the buses. And then I realized that was just the air. And I've been on the equator multiple times, and I've never been as hot as I was in Phoenix, Arizona. And I refused to go out during the day. The entire time I was there, I just went on at night like a vampire. But anyway, Amy Mays, I digress. So Amy Mays had her electricity turned off for non-payment. And what she did was she just bought a cooler. She kept all her cold stuff in a cooler with ice. And every month she saved up and put away that money. And whenever she had enough, she would buy a solar panel. Then she would buy another solar panel. And then she was actually a trained electrician. So she took that solar array and got up on her own roof and installed this solar array. And then she wrote an article afterwards. We worked with her, and it said, let's see, it said, greed locked me out of the grid, but God-given son set me free. And so, and her story went on to inspire so many others. I lift up Roshetta Ozane, who was with the Vessel Project, and she was able to block the permit for one of these, again, oil and gas build-outs in Lake Charles, Louisiana. I lift up the Holding Institute, which is in Laredo, Texas. Again, a place that gets more days above 100 degrees than Death Valley. And the center works with immigrant folks who come through, and most of which are coming through because their livelihoods are being crushed by climate change and disaster, and because they aren't able to grow food like they used to be able to grow because of the droughts driven by climate change. And so they work with them to solarize their facility. And now their biggest bill, all that money can now go into providing services for immigrant folks who are seeking refuge. And it puts me in mind of a poem from Warsan Shire, who's a Kenyan-born Somali poet. And the name of the poem is called Home. And when she talked about immigration and the false narratives around immigration, she reframes it and says that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. And that really points out to us the type of desperation that it takes to immigrate in the way that many folks have to. I lift up Jessica Tovar of the local Clean Energy Alliance, who's doing clean energy work in California. Denise Abdul Rahman, who is in Indiana with the Black Sunlight Project. Denise Fairchild and Mishka Mitchell, who are the former and existing presidents of the Emerald Cities Collaborative. Tammy Bang Lu with the Bus Riders Union in Los Angeles, that has run many victories around shifting to affordable transit. Karen Earl with the Genesee Center for Domestic Violence Prevention and Intervention, who managed to work with a group called Homeboys Industries that took people who were in gangs and actually trained them on energy efficiency and clean energy installation. And they actually trained the people who were residents in the domestic violence transitional housing so that they actually were able to get on their own roof and install solar panels. And they were trained to then be able to go out and become a part of the solar industry themselves. And so now they're living independently and they are a part of the new energy revolution. Back to Chicago, where the challenges persist that I described, but also assets bloom and flourish thanks to the leadership of folks like the late Hazel Johnson, Naomi Davis from the Blacks in Green, and Rose Joshua of the Southside branch of the NAACP. Finally, I lift up the Hopi sister, who stood before the Colorado State House and called out the corporatocracy, holding a sign that said, "Frack you fracking frackers," to protest the harms that are being done to the ancestral lands and livelihoods by profit seekers. So these amazing leaders are up against so much. We put out a report called Fossil Fueled Foolery, where we talked about the ways that the fossil fuel industry is using their billions to suppress and oppress as they continue to pollute. We lift up Shirley Chisholm, whose campaign mantra was unbought and unbossed, pushing back against corporate interests that try to force us to work against our own best interest. Most recently, we developed a report called Who Holds the Power, that talked about public service commissions and who is really governing those public service commissions. It's not really the public in whose interest too many of them act. They often are acting at the behest of corporations, and we're talking about shifting the power. So whether it's the PUCs, the PSCs, the Office of the Governor, Senator, mayors, or city councils or zoning boards, we know that there are the policies that we can advance to make this a new energy economy that's rooted in the principles and practices of earth rights and human rights. So policies like the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which was developed for the people, by the people. Policies like the Future Energy Job Acts, like that was created from people who are energy advocates, but also returning citizens, also labor, who all saw multi-solving ways that we can generate energy, create jobs, protect public health, all at the same time. Policies like universal basic income, which might not seem like an energy policy, but when we think in terms of intersectionality, we know that people need to be able to afford to pay their energy bills in order for us to make this transition. So bringing us back to the words of the spoken word artist, Rashina Fountain, hope isn't a vacant lot. In 1824, French physicist Carnot published Reflections on the Motive Power of Fire, which revolutionized the field of thermodynamics. Hope is the bright future being paved by the 10 women that I named and so many more who are revolutionizing how we see energy with the motive power of their fiery passion and drive. Together, they are revolutionizing how we produce energy and showing the way towards a new energy economy, which is rooted in the new solidarity economy of which we can all be a part. And hopefully you're already all a part. So in closing, to continue to inspire us, I'll leave us with the words of Amanda Gorman, who is a now banned youth poet laureate. In her poem, The Hill We Climb, she leaves us with the words, "When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light. If only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. And now it is our tradition, in tradition, we are delighted to feature as part of today's programming a lecture in honor of Jackie. Today's lecture is given by my colleague, Shelley Welton, Presidential Distinguished Professor of Law and Energy Policy with the Kleinman Center and the Penn Carey Law. Here at the law school, Shelley teaches environmental law, climate change law, and a seminar on networks, platforms, and utilities. I know you all want to take it. She also teaches Introduction to Energy Policy, as many of you in the room know, and it's a university-wide graduate course for the Kleinman Center. Her scholarship focuses on how climate change is transforming energy and environmental governance within the United States and transnationally. Current research projects include exploring a just energy transition for the US South, understanding what lessons the failed nuclear renaissance offers for climate infrastructure development, and investigating grid reliability governance under climate change. Her scholarship has appeared in many publications, including the Yale Law Review, Stanford Law Review, California Law Review, Columbia Law Review, Michigan Law Review, and Harvard Environmental Law Review. Shelley's presentation today is titled Designing Institutions for Clean Energy Justice.
Hey, let me start with an enormous thank you to the Kleinman Center staff who put this amazing event together, to Scott for the center's existence, to Sonia and Fritz, and most centrally to Jackie for the amazing work that you do. It is an absolute privilege to be able to deliver this lecture in your honor. In case all of you hadn't heard, it's kind of big week for democracy right now. And whatever happens at the macro level this week, one of the things I want to convince you of this afternoon is that more micro level attention to democracy, how it manifests in institutions at the state, the regional, and the federal levels, is vital to achieving a just energy future and addressing climate change. This fact is going to remain true no matter what the outcome of the election is. So thank you all very much for showing up on election eve to think through some of these enduring democratic challenges with me. I want to begin with an assessment from the scholar Sabeel Rahman, who says, advancing justice requires building public institutions that are democratically accountable and responsive, and that have the authorities and capacities to ensure equity and justice, dismantling systems of domination and inequality. And I like this quote because it explicitly links justice and democracy and accountability, which is what I hope to do today in the energy policy realm. So here's my basic thesis. Our energy institutions are ill-equipped to manage clean energy justice concerns. And understanding how institutional design relates to some of these substantive justice challenges opens pathways for reforms that can help advocates achieve clean energy justice. So to advance this claim, I want to address 5 questions this afternoon. First, what is clean energy justice? Second, what institutions does it implicate? Third, how does institutional design tie to clean energy justice aims? Fourth, how might we improve institutions to help advance these aims? And finally, how might the landmark 2022 climate legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, influence this analysis? So I thought I'd begin by defining what I mean by clean energy justice. And we might tease out two different threads within this phrase. The first is clean energy. Right, so clean is often used as a synonym for carbon-free these days, and laws promoting clean energy often define it as such. But carbon-free sources include a wide variety of technologies that may have pernicious side effects and harmful effects throughout their life cycles. So to give two of the most colorful examples here, Maryland includes the burning of chicken litter within its clean energy laws, and North Carolina includes the capturing of methane gas from hog waste within its clean energy laws. Now, in both cases, it might be a wise use of animal waste that would otherwise pollute the air and water, but many communities that are burdened by these facilities worry that an additional revenue stream for these industries is going to perpetuate or expand their operations that are often deeply unpleasant and unhealthy to live near or work within. And so justice concerns permeate even basic legal definitions in this space. Okay, so the second thread within this phrase that I want to tease out is energy justice. And I've put up here what the scholar Kirsten Jenkins called a rudimentary working definition of energy justice. This is from 2018. Energy justice aims to provide all individuals across all areas with safe, affordable, and sustainable energy. Since the time this was written, scholars have expanded and developed this definition considerably, and they often relate it to a lot of the core tenets of justice studies more generally, so distributional, recognitional, procedural, and restorative justice. I think these are useful frames, but in many ways they can seem abstract. And so instead, in a moment, I want to frame clean energy justice around a series of sort of much more concrete to the point questions. First, though, let me just bring these three words together and talk about what I mean in employing the phrase clean energy justice. I'm using this phrase to deliberately cabin my inquiry today for purposes of manageability, moving away from every justice implication of the energy transition to focus specifically on how to make sure the new clean energy that we build does not replicate the past mistakes of other energy systems. This chart, though it's a little busy, helps get at what I'm trying to discuss and not discuss today. So these are Energy Information Administration projections of the energy mix, well, actual energy mix in 2022, and then different projections of what the energy mix might look like in 2050 based on a bunch of different assumptions about technological development, oil and gas supply, how much growth we have, what prices look like. And you can see the various sources are color-coded along the, whatever that is, right for you. So one obvious troubling point that you might observe about this is that none of these scenarios get us anywhere near our 2050 goal of net zero carbon emissions, right? There's still considerable oil and natural gas and even a little bit of coal in the system in all the scenarios. These questions of how to ensure a full and fair transition away from fossil fuels while not leaving behind communities that are tied to them in various ways is a critical one for energy justice, and it's often discussed under the banner of just transition. But for today's purposes, I'm interested in a different question. What's coming onto this system under any plausible scenario is a lot of clean energy. So how do we build this better and more justly than we have the system of the past? What kinds of institutional changes might be necessary to facilitate a just expansion of clean energy? So to ground this inquiry, as I said, I want to frame clean energy justice as implicating four key questions. Who pays? Who benefits? What kind and where does it all go? And then fourth, who decides? I'm going to spend most of my time today on the who decides question, but let me just say another word about the first three up here. So first, who pays? Overall, and in the long term, if the clean energy transition is done well, it could ultimately reap far more benefits than it costs. But it's a capital-intensive transition, and the costs of actually building this infrastructure have to fall somewhere. So the first major justice consideration is, how are these costs apportioned? In 2024, the Bureau of Labor Statistics found that electricity prices rose even faster than general inflation, putting considerable strain upon many families. One reason for this strain is the way in which we fund most clean energy infrastructure, which is through electricity bills that we each pay as ratepayers. But it's underappreciated the extent to which funding clean energy infrastructure through bills is a regressive way to cover infrastructure costs. So I imagine that many here are already familiar with this terminology, but just to unpack this claim a little bit. We usually talk about regressivity with respect to taxes. And what I put up here is a chart showing a progressive tax where as your income rises, you pay a higher percentage towards the tax. A regressive tax where as your income rises, you pay a smaller percentage towards the tax, and a proportional, which is even across. The classic example of a progressive tax is the federal income tax. Classic example of a regressive tax, gas tax. As it happens, pricing electricity on a per kilowatt hour basis is also quite regressive. So the average energy burden for US households, which is to say the percentage of their income that they spend on energy, is typically between 3 and 5%, while the average for low-income households is between 15 and 18%. So this underscores two key points I want to make on this topic of ratepayers versus taxpayers. First, electricity rates are a regressive way to fund clean energy infrastructure as compared to income taxes. And second, efforts to control electricity expenditures are in some ways inherently progressive and justice enhancing because you're most helping lower income consumers. Okay, so the second consideration under who pays is a wonky one, how rates are designed. So to make this a little bit more concrete and accessible, I thought I'd offer a particular rate design challenge up for consideration. There've been a lot of fights recently about how to compensate those people who put solar on their roofs for sending electricity back to the grid. If the rate's too low, nobody's going to put solar on their roof, and that's not good for the clean energy transition. But if the rates are too high, then those with rooftop solar, who are typically wealthier homeowners, won't pay their fair share of grid costs, which will be shunted onto other consumers. And this is no hypothetical or small matter. In California, researchers recently calculated that those without rooftop solar were paying hundreds of dollars a year to cover the grid-related costs of those with solar, which is a decidedly regressive outcome. All to say, the design of rates has major justice implications. Okay, third, concerns about who pays go far beyond dollars. The millions of families that are disconnected each year from electricity for failure to pay suffer terrible health, economic, and social consequences, as vividly documented in the work of Sonia Carey. In order to avoid disconnection, many families live in discomfort or danger and forego things like medicines and foods or enrichment opportunities for their kids. The second big clean energy justice question is who benefits? Now, of course, to a certain extent, the answer is everyone. Clean energy helps address the problem of climate change. What's more, clean energy often equates with reduced conventional air pollution, and cleaner air is one of the central gateways to better health. But the benefits are still unequally distributed in many ways. Some communities are more rapidly replacing dirty infrastructure with clean infrastructure than others. And as I've hinted at, some people are reaping big rate and bill savings from the way clean energy compensation has been structured to date, while others, like renters, often cannot participate in these programs and savings. One thing you've probably heard about clean energy recently is that remarkably and thankfully, it's finally cost competitive with other sources, such that deploying renewable energy should help bring overall system costs down. But that's only true if producers pass those savings on to consumers. And whether that happens depends centrally upon choices made by energy regulators. Indeed, there's evidence that many of the savings that the move to electricity markets over the past several decades produced did not go to consumers, but instead has been captured as producer surplus under the rules that we have in place. So finally, the clean energy transition is often celebrated for potentially creating millions of manufacturing and installation and maintenance jobs. But questions of justice should prompt us to ask, who's getting these jobs and on what terms? Early evidence suggests that women and minorities are not proportionally represented in clean energy industries, and that by and large, clean energy developers prefer non-union labor and rarely pay at the same levels as diminishing fossil fuel jobs. All right, the third big clean energy question is what kinds and where does it all go? As I suggested earlier, choosing among clean energy technologies often has major justice implications, be it the industrial landscape and risks that might accompany carbon capture or hydrogen development, or the significant additional land requirements of wind and solar as compared to natural gas or nuclear energy. There are creative ways to reduce clean energy's ancillary impacts, such as co-location with other uses, but the demands it makes upon host communities are nevertheless real, if different in scope and scale than fossil fuel infrastructure. So finally, my fourth clean energy justice question is who decides? I'm going to focus the remainder of my remarks on this fundamental question, which in many ways drives the answers to all the other questions. And the first point that I want to make in this regard is a celebratory one. So households, communities, workers, and civil society groups are cohering visions and movements for clean energy justice. Civil society groups are doing much of the work of such movement and vision building. One exemplar is, of course, Jackie's organization, the Chisholm Legacy Project. I've had the privilege of working with another recently, the Tennessee Valley Energy Democracy Project, in my work on energy justice in the Southeast. This group held listening tours across the TVA Valley in 2019 and 2020 and used those to transformed the listening tour into a democratically grounded vision for the future of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the big utility that serves that region, called the People's Vision, published in 2020. Through this same research project, we've also been interviewing energy vulnerable households in the Southeast. So these are not necessarily people that are participating in movements, but they are people that self-identify as struggling to pay their electricity bill. And this research has revealed that these citizens too often have distinct hopes for the clean energy transition. First and foremost, they emphasize that affordability is their lodestar. Whether or not this transition can be done in a way that keeps energy bills affordable is going to determine their support for it. Unsurprisingly, many didn't have strong opinions beyond this, which is why having civil society groups that can stand as reliable proxies for everyday citizen concerns is critical. But some did have additional thoughts. Numerous interviewees expressed a strong interest in putting solar on their own homes if they could afford it. And several voiced more concrete systemic visions, a few of which I'll share with you here using pseudonyms for the sake of preserving confidentiality. So the first comes from Sarah in suburban South Carolina, who's worried about what new industries might come into her region as the coal plant closes down. She says, different companies will continue that we don't know that's. We're just looking at the fact that we've got jobs coming in. We are not looking at the overall picture of what it's going to do to our health, not just ours, but our children's health and the future of our communities. Lucy from urban South Carolina offered a strong set of resource preferences. I would put resources into solar farms and wind farms and the renewable options. There's plenty of land that the country has. And Tabitha, who's from rural Tennessee, offered an evocative vision of the potential benefits of local control. I actually think that if this community, from where it drops off at the mountain here and comes over to this mountain over here, if they worked together, that they could have free utilities all the way through this hollow. If all these people got together and worked together, just from a little bit of solar, a bit from the water, a little bit from the wind, I think we could all have free utilities through here. So these organizations and voices provide critical visions and indeed expertise regarding what it's going to take to make the clean energy transition a just energy transition. The question then becomes, how do these visions and expertise relate to decision-making structures on the same set of questions? I'm going to turn here just for a minute to a bit of theory. This comes from Nick Meneses and David Posen, who argue in a forthcoming article that although there's an awful lot of talk about the public interest being the goal of public law, in fact, public law's stylized appeals to the public reflect analytic imprecision and inattention to the values, views, and votes of actual people. This is a particularly acute problem in energy law, where our institutions of decision-making for the clean energy transition have led to what I am terming an energy democracy gap. And this is a gap between concerns and hopes articulated by households, communities, and workers on the one hand, and discussions, metrics, and decisions in energy institutions on the other. So most of the overarching statutes and energy law charge decision makers to do quite broad things, like determine the public convenience and necessity, or ensure just and reasonable rates. These are standards that necessarily demand consideration of what the public determines to be a good or a fair outcome. Yet there's long been very little effort to directly involve the public in energy decision-making in any meaningful ways. For most of the 20th century, this gap was little remarked upon and arguably less important. People pretty much got what they wanted out of the system: cheap and affordable electricity. Of course, even then, the harms of the system were being shunted onto marginalized communities in ways that these institutions largely ignored. But times have changed. There are now enormous questions about the shape, the scale, the pace of the clean energy transition, making this energy system a site of contestation unlike ever before. People have strong opinions about what the future of the system should look like and how to make it a fair one within their own communities and beyond. Yet energy decision-making continues to occur largely in technocratic policy forums that remain hard to penetrate and often focus on a narrow set of evaluative criteria in determining the shape of the transition. So in the remainder of my talk, I want to focus on how we might, and I'm shamelessly borrowing a Britishism here, mind this gap. And I mean mind in a very dictionary definition kind of way, which is to mind it by regarding it as important and feeling concerned about it. This gap means minding for reasons of justice, democratic legitimacy, and political legitimacy. When it comes to justice, there's little reason to believe that the same institutions that brought us the deeply unequal, disparate energy system of today will magically manage the energy transition for a radically different set of criteria without significant reform. In terms of democratic legitimacy, Menezes and Posen make the point well that legal standards written in the public interest with no real accounting for it fail to live up to basic notions of democratic governance. This failure, in turn, is closely bound up with political legitimacy. The energy transition is going to be a decades-long undertaking that requires significant upfront expenditures and transforms the landscapes and the economy of the United States. Sustained democratic support for its approaches is the only way that transformation on the scale necessary to avert humanitarian crises will be possible. So I want to offer up 3 examples of how the energy democracy gap manifests in the design and practices of energy institutions. And then I'm going to use these diagnostics to point to some pathways forward. First thing I want to do is introduce the 3 institutions that I'm going to focus on. These are not the only institutions making important decisions regarding the energy transition, but they are 3 of the most important, and they operate across 3 different scales. So the first, operating at the state scale, is state public utilities commissions, which Jackie referenced briefly. These commissions have the important job of setting the rates that we all pay, overseeing resource planning, so what gets built in the state, managing affordability, and setting policies on things like community and rooftop solar. Second institution is at the regional level. I'm going to talk about regional transmission organizations, which manage the dispatch of electricity. They engage in long-term transmission planning, so the shape of the grid, and they design electricity market and interconnection rules. So they really have a lot of say in what gets added to the system under what rules. And then the final institution I'm going to talk about is at the federal level, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which oversees regional markets and planning and sets transmission and wholesale electricity rates. Okay, so at the same time, I also want to introduce what my research has suggested are a series of salient design characteristics that inform an institution's ability and willingness to address clean energy justice concerns. So those criteria are the background and motivation of decision makers, the organization's culture and capacity, legal constraints on the exercise of its authority and interpretations thereof, I might add, the public regulatory interface, and the strength of civil society organizations. So I'm now going to put these pieces in conversation to talk about challenges across these design dimensions in each of my 3 institutions that I just introduced. So first, let's talk about public utility commissions. I'm not going to talk about background and motivation decision makers with respect to PUCs very much, except to note, as Jackie already did, that the Chisholm Project has done amazing work on this question of who is serving as commissioners. So their 2022 report makes the case for representational governance in public utility commissions, which is a critical feature of who's running these organizations. But I'm going to focus instead on two other aspects of institutional design at PUCs: culture and capacity, and legal constraints on the exercise of their authority. So PUCs have remarkably similar duties from state to state, but vary dramatically in their staffing levels and in their institutional cultures. And many states where there's been a growing distrust of the administrative state, PUC staffing has shrunk over time. So for example, whereas California has 32 commission staff per 1 million residents, Utah has 0.5. Moreover, commission work often suffers a distinct pay gap as compared to the private utility sector. So I've had many state commissioners bemoan to me the difficulty of keeping on staff good engineers or analysts who, as soon as they hire them, are hired away by the private utility at double the pay and go to work for the people that they were regulating just weeks before. Without adequate staff, commission's ability to scrutinize utility rate filings for their justice implications and to engage in more forward-looking rulemakings to improve the equity of the system is severely limited. When it comes to legal constraints, it is again notable the extent to which states converge in their governing legal standards for the electricity system. Regulators pretty much everywhere operate under requirements that the system should be designed in the public interest and that rates and practices should be just, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. Right? So note, justice and non-discrimination are literally and textually key touchstones in this space. However, as pioneering work by the legal scholars, one legal scholar, one social scientist, Alex Klass and Gabe Chan has shown, states diverge considerably in how they interpret these mandates. So Klass and Chan find that regulators frequently take an economistic approach to these terms, seeking to replicate what the results of competition would have been in a non-regulated monopoly context, and insisting that the language of their statutes compels them to do as much. However, as Klass and Chan convincingly demonstrate, there's substantial social judgment baked into any methodology for setting rates, including a choice to mimic an idealized state of perfect competition that doesn't exist in the real world. So these institutional features create real impediments to clean energy justice in many states, but not all. And I often worry that we as legal scholars focus on the problems with these institutions, but rarely highlight the good that they can do when they take a broader view of their mission. And so here I want to pull in one real world example worth celebrating. This, Marissa Gillette, who's head of Connecticut's Public Utility Regulatory Authority since 2019. Despite facing aggressive and personal pushback from utilities, Commissioner Gillette has substantially reformed utility rates and practices since she took over, putting in place new clean energy performance incentives and focusing particularly on affordability. And she's explicitly linked her commission's new direction to democratic accountability, explaining on a recent podcast. I'm going to read her words now. I think that we as regulators collectively need to get off our hands and say, look, the public policies of the state are X, Y, and Z. And the state has said that they're using the utility infrastructure to achieve some of these. Maybe your goal is affordability for all. Maybe your goal is greenhouse gas reductions. Whatever it is, there are goals that we should be designing around. We should be telling the utility, if you have a choice between spending $2 million on a new pole and wire or $2 million on battery storage and energy efficiency, we should be telling them which of those solutions they should be deploying, not in individual instances, but rather by our philosophical approach and encouraging them to operate their business around the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. All to say, culture, capacity, and a broad understanding of the legal mission of the organization matter tremendously for institutions' ability to pursue and implement clean energy justice. I'm going to turn now to a second institution and a second set of institutional features, regional transmission organizations. And here I am going to focus on the background of decision makers piece of the puzzle. So RTOs are voluntary membership organizations, or what I've elsewhere described as private membership clubs, clubs that are comprised of mostly commercially interested parties. And they're in charge of various portions of the grid, in most parts of the United States, as you can see on the map here. They make the consequential decisions I discussed earlier. As a refresher, they dispatch electricity, they engage in long-term planning for the grid, and they design electricity market and interconnection rules. It turns out membership clubs of incumbent utilities and generators are not an ideal way to make decisions for clean energy justice. These entities routinely plan a system that maximizes profits, but costs consumers more, while blocking new clean energy entrants and resisting the build out of an efficient, more interconnected grid. So just to give you one example of how this is playing out and the scale of the challenge, one 2020 study found that a comprehensive approach to building transmission in just the eastern half of the United States could produce consumer savings of $100 billion through 2050, decreasing the average bill rate by more than 1/3. As this suggests, self-governance in this space has become a real impediment to just decision-making. The background and motivation of decision makers matters. So finally, on to my third institution and a deeper dive into my final two criteria, the public regulatory interface and the strength of civil society organizations through the lens of FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Let me start with the strength of civil society organizations. In most ways, this isn't really a feature of institutional design, but an external variable that acts upon these institutions, except that I want to suggest that agencies may have more influence here than is commonly appreciated. So FERC has long been seen as a deeply technocratic agency with its focus on the economic efficiency of the bulk power transmission, of the bulk power grid and wholesale electricity sales, which can make anybody zone out in a hot second. It does have mechanisms in place for public participation, which make up its public regulatory interface. Parties can intervene in FERC dockets in which they have an interest, and they can file comments and expert testimony. But it's long been hard to connect what FERC does to concrete issues of energy justice. The decisions that FERC makes most directly affect industry players and only indirectly flow down into the rates that consumers pay and the types of energy that actually get built. And for many decades, FERC did little to dispel the notion that it was a commercial economic regulator. Even when it was ordered by Congress in 1978 to create an Office of Public Participation to help the public more effectively engage, it sat on its hands and simply didn't do so for about another 40 years. So fast forward to the pandemic and the flurry of legislation that came out. Into these bills got slipped a little remarked provision that actually gave FERC a deadline to create this office. And to its credit, many at FERC at this point enthusiastically embraced the mission. And in the past couple of years, they've stood up an Office of Public Participation that's doing some really great work at the public regulatory interface by providing explainers and workshops and trainings on participatory mechanisms, targeted guidance to Native nations, and a bunch of community outreach events. And doing this kind of affirmative work at the interface, not just making it easier to participate, but cultivating the kinds of voices that have long been absent in decision-making processes, not only improves participation, but also may strengthen civil society groups themselves as they become more effective at communicating the justice implications of FERC's work to the public at large. There's certainly more work to be done here, but I offer this as a hopeful story of the possibility of reforms in the right direction. That's it. I want to acknowledge a note of caution and critique here that I believe is also important. And I'm going to draw here on the work of legal scholar Nick Bagley, who has voiced concerns about what he calls a procedure fetish in public law. He says, administrative law is shot through with arguably counterproductive procedural rules. Along the way, a positive vision of the administrative state, one in which its legitimacy is measured not by the stringency of the constraints under which it labors, but by how well it advances our collective goals, has been shoved to the side. It's well past time for more skepticism about procedure. And I take these concerns seriously in energy policy. There's ample research showing that more process often redounds to powerful and moneyed interests, rather than assisting those who have consistently been left out in the past. And so I join those that argue for deeper structural institutional reforms rather than accretive process changes in this space. Okay, So what might such reforms look like? I'm going to come back here to the energy democracy gap concept. Jackie's organization and her prior work at the NAACP is emblematic of a slew of organizations and people that are doing tremendous work to bridge this gap from the community side. I'm interested in how to narrow it from the other side, right, from a place of institutional design. So I'm going to offer 5 suggestions here. The first is to reclaim the public in public utility law. I'm deeply troubled by the perversities of self-regulation during the clean energy transition and believe that FERC has considerable untapped authority to oversee and direct how the electricity system is planned and managed in the public interest. Similarly, as I mentioned, state commissions have wider latitude than they often believe to incorporate considerations of justice into their rate-setting authority, and scholars and advocates should be pressing them to embrace this latitude. Second, reorient understandings of expertise in the transition. Under a more capacious understanding of the role of justice in public utility law, a different set of voices should become experts. Those with lived experiences of systematic energy injustice and groups that can credibly claim to speak on behalf of these constituencies. They have valuable expertise to offer, and it should be treated as such. This requires culture change within energy institutions to promote and apply the value of such expertise and to accept such expertise in the forms that it comes in, rather than requiring it to be filtered through techno-economic jargon. Third, think beyond traditional rate making and market design. The fact that we have historically paid for electricity through per kilowatt hour charges on our electricity bills doesn't mean that we have to continue doing so going forward, especially under conditions when we also want folks to electrify everything, which is a goal in deep tension with unaffordable electricity prices. California's pioneering efforts to move towards a progressive system for pricing electricity, and in the process dramatically upending settled norms in this space. Scholars and advocates should continue to press for creativity in electricity pricing and should press regulators to embrace competition only under conditions where it demonstrably serves ratepayers at the end of the day. Fourth, bolster institutional capacity. For all the denigration of energy regulators that often occurs, it's often not malevolence, but incapacity at work. So shifting in some instances from a narrative of ill-intentioned institutions to understaffed, under-resourced institutions may improve outcomes for clean energy justice, as more staff power can help push back against ill-advised utility proposals, speed analysis of interconnection requests, and advance forward-looking rulemakings. Fifth, relinquish control. Posen and Meneses make a really useful conceptual move in their forthcoming article that I'd referenced earlier, in which they describe how modern administrative law makes the public monitors, but rarely authors of policy. And I find this statement to ring quite true in the energy policy space. There are many ways, though, that more authorial control could be given to the public, including communities and civil society organizations, through, for example, through programs like community choice aggregation, which gives communities the ability to select their own electricity supply, or more boldly, through public ownership of clean energy resources or joint public-private schemes, where communities have a real say and stake in what gets built and who benefits from it. All right, so I'm drawing to a close, but I want to leave you with one final set of thoughts that I admit is still inchoate. I'm researching these questions at present, and I'm interested in the thoughts and reactions of others. And that question is, does the Inflation Reduction Act mind the gap? So for those who might be thrown by its unusual title, the IRA is the largest climate bill in US history, and it was eked out of the barest of Senate majorities in the summer of 2022. In terms of climate impacts, the projections are impressive and heartening, and I'm immensely grateful to those who fought tirelessly to achieve these results. So I put up here a chart of what the IRA is going to do to shift US greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see, the chart bends the emissions curve considerably from what it would look like without the IRA to what it looks like with the IRA, reducing emissions in 2050 by about another 25%. Though, lest any of us be lulled towards complacency, I wanted to add, this is the trajectory that's projected to be necessary to avert the most catastrophic levels of warming and consequent suffering. But what I want to focus on now is not the gap on the slide, but the energy democracy gap and how the IRA influences it. So here I've pulled a chart of the major elements of the IRA grouped by policy mechanism. And as you see, the bulk goes to grants, to consumer incentives to install clean energy technology, and to corporate incentives to build clean energy infrastructure. Many of the grants have a justice-specific focus. So for example, $7 billion goes to a Solar for All program that's going to help create new and expand existing low-income solar programs. Some of these grants also try to help low-income consumers take advantage of the same clean energy technologies that these estimated 43 benefits in tax incentives, consumer will for higher income households. But the bulk of funding, at least $216 billion on this chart, but more recently estimated to probably be something more like double or triple this amount, goes to clean energy infrastructure developers. And it's here that I want to ask, how does this money change the clean energy justice landscape that I've been talking about? Let's come back to our questions. So in terms of who pays, the IRA allows more clean energy costs to be borne by the general US Treasury rather than ratepayers. This should represent a shift in a more just direction, assuming again that savings get passed on to consumers and not just swallowed by clean energy financiers. In terms of who particularly benefits, these tax credits put a thumb on the scale for higher paying skilled labor and the use of domestically manufactured components by allowing a base tax credit to quintuple 5 times in size if the developer pays prevailing wages and runs an apprenticeship program, and to add another 10% for meeting domestic content requirements. So for those who get these jobs, these incentives should help make them good jobs. What kinds? And where does it all go? Here, I have some concerns. The tax credits are designed to converge towards neutrality as to clean energy technologies, leaving the marketplace to decide what gets built. But there are specific place-based preferences baked into the credits. Developers get a 10% bonus if they build in an energy community, which is essentially a community with an industrial fossil fuel past, and 10% for building in a low-income community. Obviously, that puts a thumb on the scale for building clean energy infrastructure in these marginalized communities, which could be a wonderful instantiation of restorative justice for a community that wants such infrastructure, and quite problematic for a community that does not. Finally, who decides? In this tax credit forward scheme, the ultimate answer is the developers. Now, there's siting hoops to be jumped through at various levels, and state regulation and transmission capacity will continue to shape what kinds of generation gets built in many parts of the country. But the bottom line is, both regulators and communities will need to be more attuned than ever to the ways in which development patterns play out under this massive infusion of capital into clean energy infrastructure. And our energy institutions are our best hope for injecting planning, rationality, equity, and democracy into this private capital forward scheme. It's thus a pivotal time for achieving or failing to achieve clean energy justice, making institutional reforms to elevate these issues a more pressing priority than ever. I want to end with a quote from Jackie herself, from the wonderful book, All We Can Save, which is a collection of essays by women in the climate movement. In her essay, Jackie says, "Across the country and world, community by community, people are building microcosms of the systems and societies we need to reverse the tide of catastrophic climate change and become a world that respects rights for all people in harmony with Mother Earth. In short, resistance is rising and systems are changing." My goal today has been to convince you that our institutions too must change to meet the moment. Advocates are working admirably and tirelessly toward clean energy justice. Reforms in institutional design must help them close the gap between our current fossil fuel-based system and what people want and deserve in a clean energy future. Thanks.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you both for your inspiring and lightning energy. Thank you all for coming today as well. It's been wonderful to share this with you. If anyone wasn't able to come that you know is really interested in watching, this recording will be available on our website, so feel free to check it out and pass it along. And in a couple of weeks, Jackie will also be featured on an upcoming podcast episode of Energy Policy Now. I'd also like to take this opportunity to announce that Jackie has agreed to be a Kleinman Center Senior Fellow this year, and we're very excited about that. So we are very pleased that we will have the opportunity to welcome Jackie back multiple times throughout the year, and for all of you to have the opportunity to meet with her and engage with her. I have just a few other quick reminders. First, as Shelley told us, tomorrow is a really important day for democracy, so get out and vote. And second, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the Kleinman Center staff for your amazing work on setting up this event. Thank you. Now let's continue our celebration with a reception in Jackie's honor. Just exit through the doors and head down the grand staircase to the lobby, and we will see you there. Thank you all.